decided I'd make a little tutorial video on how to do the Netflix bypass. That is for people like me. We are not in the US, so when we log into Netflix, all we get is the Latin America movies. But sometimes you want to bypass the Latin America movies and get like the US movies. So in order to do that, it's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to explain how you go about doing that using the whiteboard. Alright, so first thing you need to have, when I did it, was essentially I had two private servers, virtual private servers, and essentially you need to modify the DNS. That is the easiest way. Now, this will work for most of the newer model devices. It didn't work for my Sony Google TV, the older version or the new version that coming out. That should probably work. I'm not exactly sure. And it doesn't work, surprisingly, too, for the Sony DVD players. But it works for everything else. So it works on the Samsung phones, it works on the tablets, it works on any Google device with version 4.0 up. So essentially, the easiest way is to change, especially for systems that don't have VPN or proxy settings on the Android system or whichever system you're using. The easiest way is to change the DNS settings. So I'll first of all give you an example of how that works, so you could keep an eye on the whiteboard and see how it goes. Alright, so this is the whiteboard here. Alright, so essentially this is how it works. You resolve the netflix.com which in turn resolves to some IP address. Normally this IP address would be it's an arbitrary. I'm just giving an example here. This is not the IP address, but let's just say the IP address is 200.1.100.1. Right. Essentially what Netflix does is Netflix, through your DNS here, when you search for netflix.com, the DNS returns this back to you. No idea why that's not right then. Right. So this would be, to me, if I'm in Trinidad, the DNS would give me a Netflix that is located in Latin America. So this IP returning here is our Latin America IP, which is not what we want, because essentially this will only give us the Latin America content, which is what we don't want. So what we want is really the US IP. So in order to get the US IP, you would have to basically override DNS. Alright, so let's do this back over. So let's say this is you in your home. You connect to a router. And your router connects to the internet. Okay, good. So essentially your IP address, let's just say this is on the LAN, right? So this is on your local area network. This is the internal IP. You will have something like your computer IP would be 192.168.1.2, and your router IP would most likely be 192.168.1.1. Right. Now your gateway setting would be 192.168.1.1, because essentially it's basically you're telling the computer to pass through this router to get to the internet, which is 1.1. And then your DNS would be 192.168.1.1, which is also a router if you think about it that way. So that's essentially how your standard setup would be. So let's say that the router needed to get the IP address of Netflix. Netflix would have responded with the Latin America IP. Let's say that's 200.1.100.1. And that would return to the router DNS and then return to here, to you. Right? Now, I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but the reason I'm telling you that is because I'm trying to explain how you go about bypassing that. So to bypass that, to bypass getting this Latin America, LATM, Latin America IP, you'd need to have a different DNS. You need to have a different, you need to search a different DNS server. One that is already hard coded with the US IP. So let's break this down back again. So what would change is this: you'd have to have a server in between. So it would now become you go into your router like normal, goes to internet, right? We know that. But instead of you bringing back the DNS from here, we're going to bring back a DNS from another server here, which is let's call this DNS2. Let's just call it that. No, let's just call it DNSB. So you'll have to have a server, a VPS server running bind, which is a DNS server, and hard coded to get the US IP. That's the first part. So in other words, you here would now become, you would still be 192.168.1.2, and your gateway would still be your router's gateway, router's IP, which is 1, but you're changing your DNS. So your DNS will no longer be this. Your DNS would be your DNSB IP address. So if your DNS, let's say your DNSB IP address was 50.1.1.1, you'd put that 50.1.1.1. Alright, so your DNS1, and then you put your DNS, well, you could leave your DNS2 without anything. That's fine. As long as your DNSB server, this server, has a record for Netflix with the US IP. Well, technically it wouldn't be the US IP, but I'll explain that just now. So let's just say the Netflix.com would be another IP. It would not be the 200.100.200.1.100. Instead, you'd have to set this to your proxy. So the Netflix should point to your proxy IP. If that making any sense. Netflix should point to your proxy IP. And this proxy should be in the US. So, as I say, it gets a little bit complicated, but essentially you have to have now a proxy server. So your proxy IP. So your proxy server, let's say your proxy server is 50.2.2.2. So essentially your DNS record would be a record netflix.com, and then the A record would point to your proxy, which is 50.2.2.2, and this server has to be in the US. That's the only way for it to work. Now essentially I said all that to say that by doing all this, what you're essentially doing is you're telling your browser or your Netflix application to point directly to your proxy. And by pointing to your proxy now, so you're basically from you, just to simplify it, you will go to your proxy, which will then pull from Netflix US. I hope that makes sense. And then so Netflix US will return to the proxy, and the proxy will then forward it to you. And that's essentially how the Netflix DNS bypass works. I use HA proxy, just to give you a little hint. I use HA proxy to do this because HA proxy allows SSL connections, which you will need for Netflix sometimes. And you could probably Google up more details on how to set up the HA proxy. I hope that this helped a little bit. It's a little bit complicated. For most of you, you may not understand it, but a few of you will. So help each other out and see how best you can get it done. Okay, thanks, bye.